Kanche Kiowa, Valerie McLeod Deshinakashin. I'm running for Eastern Region 3 Regional Representative, and this is video number 2 of my platform for the Métis Nation Saskatchewan election coming up May 24th. Maybe you're watching this Friday, May 23rd. Maybe it's already the 24th. You have from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. to go vote. And if you need help with any information at all about where to do that, how to do that, or need help getting there, just holler at me, get at me, and I'll help you out. No problem. So let's talk about my platform, which I've stolen the acronym CIRNAC from the federal government. They use that for Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, which is, we used to know it as INAC, but basically Indigenous Affairs. And I'm reappropriating it to mean the C is Constitution, and I just did that video. Now this is the I, identity. And here are the two big pieces I want to talk about with identity. One is our registry, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan Registry, and the other is the MICHIF language. So let's start with the registry. One of the things that I think is very crucial that we need to consider, and that currently is not the case, is who is really controlling our registry and who has access to our registry, because right now it's not us. And I think there's something inherently wrong in that when we talk about being a self-government or a self-governing people. If you think of First Nations, if there's a band, you know, they have a band list. They know who their members are, and they can access that. You know, it's usually just right in the band office. There's the band list, right? Unfortunately for us, we can't really access our own registry. And I think, you know, initially maybe the intention there was trying to have an arm's length so that, you know, it couldn't be manipulated for political reasons. But what has ended up happening is there's a completely separate department that's the registry department, and there's employees there. You know, not all of them are going to be Métis. We don't really know exactly a lot about the employees in general. The 350 employees that work for the MNS, we don't know a lot about who they are or how to find them, and there's no directory online. But the other thing is the chief of staff is the same person who's the CEO, this Richard Quintal, who came to us as an employee of Indigenous Affairs from the federal government. And, you know, being that he's the chief of staff, that kind of positions him also as the head of the registry. So, you know, that registry has really grown since I registered in 2013. There were fewer than 4,000 people on it. Now there's supposedly 30,000, he says. So I think we need to have a way that our own people are still going to be in charge of our own registry. And if it needs to be accessed by our own people, that can happen. And, you know, I've heard a couple suggestions out there in the community of perhaps having an elders council who are sort of the head of the registry, and they can, you know, really go in and look then, and, you know, if there's questions about identity and belonging, that we do have some method of being able to really check that, you know, because I do want to mention this because I think this is very important. And, you know, a lot of information on this hasn't been made public and really discussed in the public, and an election is a great time to do that. Richard Quintal, who came to us from the federal government as an employee of Indigenous Affairs in a 2016 third-party management agreement, that really there was not much option of signing at that point for the MNS. They were, you know, we were put into a situation that we were essentially about to be bankrupt, but Canada had really helped that along by cutting all funding to the MNS, and you got to think about that too going ahead. Like if they've done it once before, I don't see why they couldn't do it again. And is that really building self-government or self-determination if the federal government just turn off the tap at any old moment, and next thing you know, we're forced into signing a contract that signs it over to somebody else? And how that impacted our registry, I want people to know this because it was right in the contract. And this contract was intentionally held confidential for 3 years when it was signed in 2016. And then it was quietly uploaded online in 2019 in a financial packet, which is where I found it. But this wasn't, you know, this was hidden from our own people, which I think is really sad. And I'd question why it was hidden from our own people. And in that contract, it says that Ernst & Young, the accounting firm, would be making a copy of our registry and taking it off-site. Now, prior to that, when I registered, I still have my, you know, my documentation from that. The privacy policy said that our personal information, which we're handing over to MNS when we do that, is going to be kept at head office at the MNS, and it's not going to be shared, and it's not going to be stored off-site. Now, when this happens and this agreement happens, we weren't made known of this. We never consented to any change in the situation. So all of a sudden, all of our personal information was taken by Ernst & Young and copied and stored off-site. And then it also said it could be, that they could be sharing information with their partners, in order to execute their contract. Well, partners is quite ambiguous. Canada, the federal government, was a partner of Ernst & Young at that time in this whole thing. So did they get a copy of our registry at that point without, our consent? There's some big questions there. And then the next thing I want to talk about is, Richard Quintal, when he comes from Indigenous Affairs in 2016, is a high-ranking officer there, high-ranking manager. And, there's been some reports of changing identity over the last 8 years, from not Métis to saying Métis but not your Métis, to then a claim of being Métis from Mattawa, Ontario, which is one of the MNO new Métis communities or disputed Métis communities. It's very controversial out there right now. To then November 2024, at the Legislative Assembly, there was a coming home ceremony with Richard Quintal getting a citizenship card for the MNS that wasn't on the agenda that day. So I don't really know. He's the clerk of the Assembly too. He's the chief of staff, the CEO, the clerk of the Assembly. Somehow he seems to be sort of in charge of everything. But if it's not on the agenda, it's not supposed to be approved to be happening. And somehow there was this ceremony, and it was announced he received a citizenship card, and he's now on the registry. And the one ancestor, the only ancestor that he claimed his historic connection through, was the same ancestor that when I spoke to him there later in the day by myself, and I walked up to him and I said, "Oh, Richard, well, where's your family from?" And he said, "You mean my Métis family?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Red River." And I said, "Oh, well, what were their family names?" And he said, "Malliot." Just that one. Only that one. And same thing as when in the ceremony, it was just that one. So if there are more ancestors that he has or other connections, he hasn't declared that to our Legislative Assembly or to me. And so, you would have to wonder why he wouldn't if there were more, because this one ancestor, Malliot, I've done the genealogy. I've, worked with a genealogist to get that information, and that is a person who was born at Winnipeg, born at the fort there in 1801 to a French fur trader and an Anishinaabe woman who were both from out east. And they moved there because he was sent there with the Northwest Company, the French fur trader, in the year 1800. So they get married there. And in 1801, they have a child there. But by 1803, they're back out east. They're at a fort on Lake Superior. And by 1804, she has left the man, and she's gone and started a relationship with a different French fur trader. So the first French fur trader and his son, they go back to Quebec. He retires to Quebec, and he raises the son there in his community, in the French community. It's not an Indigenous community. They were a well-to-do, very prominent family, involved in politics and whatnot. And that family, and they stay there for the next 220 years, right? In the French community, marrying French people, all that good stuff. So he's claiming he is a Red River Métis based on that child of two people from out east that moved there and were living at the fort there for, 1801 to 1803, where that child lives there for about 2 years, maybe 2.5 most, and then leaves, and they're never back. And so, I think it's fair to have some questions about that, especially because we all know about what's been, this trend of identity fraud that's been happening right across the country. And, I think when you're a person in a position of that kind of power, where you're the head of the registry, essentially, you're also you're the clerk of the Legislative Assembly, and you hold a ceremony to welcome yourself home and get a card and citizenship. And there were still many people waiting for cards that hadn't got them, that have been waiting a long time and still haven't got them. And this just happened, all very quickly. A few of our elected council members did have questions about that. And this piece of legislation, the coming home legislation, that had been put in place so that people who were from Saskatchewan and from communities like if you belong to a local, say in Isle of La Crosse, and then you move to Toronto for work, and you still wanted to be represented though by the MNS in your home community, you don't want to join an MNO, right? That was why they created that legislation, so you could still maintain that connection and that representation to the MNS and your home local. Now, Richard never spoke of any connection whatsoever in Saskatchewan, and he's claiming this Red River Métis connection, but even that, you know, when we talk about the Battle of Seven Oaks being this fundamental moment in our history and a defining point of this sort of shared political awareness and consciousness that the Métis came together and stood to defend, you know, their land, territory, and rights. You know, I think if you look at that happening in 1816 and everything that plays out, you know, for the next 200 years after that, his family wasn't here for any of that. And by the time it happened in 1816, that child, you know, who left at the age of probably 2 years old, had already been gone for 13 years from Red River. So I think that there's questions there, and I think that our nation and our people have a right to maybe have a discussion on this and be asking about it, because this is someone in a position of authority, you know, who's left a lot of questions for people. And the council members who put forward a resolution at that MNLA, they had asked for an audit of the process of the registry so that they could know the criteria that's being used for the Coming Home program. And I think that's very valid, because we want to know, especially since we can't go and look at our own registry and see who's on there, and they don't have the power to do that. I think those are fair questions. And if you think about a band office, you know, they can see the band list. It's usually right in the band office. They know who their members are, but we don't have the power to do that. And that seems concerning to me. So what ends up happening after that is the council members of our elected provincial Métis Council, who had, you know, put this resolution forward and asked to know the process of the registry on the Coming Home legislation specifically. They ended up getting called out in a PMC meeting by Richard Quintel by name, 4 women, and, you know, essentially threatened. He said he was putting them on notice. I could, you know, there's video of this that I would, you know, I can share again after sharing this video. But, you know, what ends up happening is he says he's filed a harassment complaint against them once they filed a harassment complaint after this outburst in this meeting that's on video. And he said that he had already verbally filed one because of what he said in the meeting. I guess there was some sort of HR review, which the HR committee was other members of the council. I don't know. And then a third party person hired to come in, who no report has ever been released or made known to our membership yet. And as far as I know, none of those 4 women were ever even able to give statements. So, and then apparently they were found to have been the harassers, and they were suspended from our council. And I want everyone to really think about this. This is a hired employee who's getting 4 of our democratically elected government officials booted off the council. And he already did this with 2 of our elected treasurers prior to this. So now that's now 6 elected officials of ours that our people put on that council, that an employee and someone who came as a employee of the federal government has somehow managed to kick out of our government. I think people really need to think about that. So, you know, I think there needs to be a conversation there, because we don't know what's happening with our registry anymore, and it seems like it's a bit of a runaway train at this point. If there is any, you know, other ancestors that he's never mentioned, you know, Richard, feel free to reach out and contact me, and I would gladly share any other information or insights that you want to provide on that. But this is, you know, I spoke to him myself and asked these questions, and this is the same information I was given, and this is all I have to go on. And unless we get other information, you know, this is the best we are going on, and we have a right, I think, to ask these questions. So lastly, on the identity piece is the MICHIF language, and I just want to, you know, I want to throw to my friend Bruce Flamond, who has really taught me a lot and has been a mentor to me, and I have heaps of respect for. And, you know, at our meeting, he came to an event, a cultural event we did in LeBret this past week. He let us know that he can say for sure, he said that he is one of less than 40 MICHIF speakers that are left. And I think we have really not done a good job here at preserving this language, and we're not going to know, as Bruce says, we're not going to know who we are anymore, because the MICHIF language is the worldview. That's how you will have the MICHIF worldview, is if you know the language. So without the language, we won't even know who we are anymore. And, you know, I've watched, when Richard Quintal first came in, we used to have a line on our financial statements at the end of every year that was for MICHIF language. It said MICHIF language. And we didn't have a lot of money back then, but I know at one point it was $100,000 at least that was going to MICHIF language. And each year after he came, that amount went down until it hit zero, and that got wiped right off the financial statements. Now you'll see funding that'll come through early childhood learning, or, you know, these other categories, but that ends up, you know, I've been told, well, there's pre-K MICHIF classes, and there's retreats, and there's workshops. And that was what someone in this region that was sort of supporting the incumbent had said to me, sort of defiantly, like, why should I even be talking about MICHIF language? I don't even know what's been happening in this region and all the things they've done, and those things were listed. And she said, well, what are you going to do for MICHIF? And, you know, I said back that, unfortunately, things like pre-K programming, I'm not against it, but pre-K programming, weekend retreats, and workshops don't build fluent MICHIF speakers. And that's what we're about to lose, is all of the fluent MICHIF speakers. So we might have a whole bunch of people in our nation who can say hi and their name and where they're from, and that's it, right? So, you know, this is an emergency as far as I'm concerned. And I really hope we're already not too late. But it is, you know, there couldn't be a more urgent topic, I think, an initiative we need to get going. And we need to throw way more resources and way more funding behind this. And, you know, we need to do everything we can to create, you know, programs that will take those beginner speakers and anyone starting out through to intermediate, to advanced, to fluent. That's what we need. And we need it fast. So we need to find those people who want to learn the language, and we need to support them and support the language speakers that we have left and make this happen. And it is so important and so urgent, or we're going to lose everything. So that is what I will leave you with for this video, and we will continue on into the next. I'm Valerie McLeod, running for Eastern Region 3, Regional Representative. I would be honored to have your vote, and if not, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. Merci.